Evening all, and well, good afternoon depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to another LOREhammer stream where we dive into an individual piece of lore from the Warhammer world, discuss its past, where it came from, what it eventually developed into, and indeed what we could potentially turn it into for our own games should we wish to do so. For example, in the game that I run online, oh pardon me, my speakers are suddenly shouting. Let me just close that off there. For the game that I run online, I've changed the Runefangs significantly while simultaneously keeping them exactly the same as they have been described in multiple versions of the lore. So today it's going to be all about Runefangs. Now, if you happen to have any other questions about other things, today's not really your day, but if you do super chat them in, I will most certainly answer them because I just can't help myself whenever someone throws cash in our direction. After all, we all need to feed and eat and so on and so forth. Not that I'm a vampire. Right, let's get on with it. So, Runefangs, what are they? Where do they come from? And how have we, in particular me, used them in various games such as Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay? The Runefangs are a collection of 12 artifacts that were created by a dwarf runesmith, one of the most famous of all dwarf runesmiths, by the name of Alaric the Mad. They were commissioned, you could say, by the good old High King of the Dwarves at the time, Kurgan Ironbeard, in return for Sigmar bringing an end to what was originally called the Goblin Wars, although it's gone through a variety of different names in different editions. But loosely speaking, for winning the Battle of Blackfire Pass, which brought an end to the Greenskin Wars that had plagued the Dwarves for not just centuries, but what felt like forever. It ended it, sealing an almost eternal relationship between the dwarfs and the Empire. In thanks, the High King commissioned 12 Runefangs, 12 great weapons that were then gifted to each one of the tribal chiefs that led one of the tribes that came to Sigmar's aid, came to the dwarfs' aid at the Blackfire Pass battle. So we know where they came from. What do we know about them? Well, cut a long story short, the Runefangs are all swords, pretty easy. And they are all magical, also pretty easy. They have all of them the Master Rune of Alaric the Mad. Now, if you don't know your dwarf lore, I'll quickly explain what that is. The Master Rune of Alaric the Mad means, in terms of the game, it automatically ignores all armor saves. So if you happen to have any armor, it just goes right through it like it was made of butter. So pretty dang potent in and of itself, but that's not all they do. And as I go through the explanation of where the Runefangs came from and how they developed over the course of various editions, you'll find out that the Runefangs are, if anything, much more special than you might first realize. So we're going to run back to the very beginning of where the Runefangs first popped up inside the lore. Now, for those of you who know your Warhammer, you'll be aware that we've gone through 8 editions of the battle game, and it's the battle game that tends to be the source of all the core lore that we use, and then various other books around it, or White Dwarves, or novels, add additional details, but the core stuff is always what is offered by the battle game. And if you happen to be out there thinking, oh, I wouldn't mind licensing a Games Workshop product, you'll probably find that if you're doing something that's Warhammer based, it's either going to be attached to the old world or attached to the 8th edition of Warhammer in terms of what sort of lore you can use. If it's all about the end times, it's at the 8th edition of Warhammer. Now, the Runefangs first popped up in the 4th edition of Runefang? In the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and they were detailed at length, well, they were detailed, shall we say, inside the Empire Army List. The Runefangs, as they were presented there, were, as I recall, only 35 points each. If you don't know your Warhammer battle points costage, that's pretty cheap for a magical artifact. And the core rule for that artifact, the rule that would later on be duplicated when we reach the Dwarf Army List, is the Master of Alaric the Mad special rule, which is no armor saves. Job's a good un. On top of that, though, all the Runefangs had another special rule, and a rule that would later on be pretty much ignored, but is worth mentioning because it speaks to the evolution of how the weapons were and what they eventually became. At that point, they had a special rule where they did double wounds against undead. Now, that might come as a surprise for those of you that know the later lore for Runefangs, but at this point, the weapons were undead-killing weapons. And it wasn't until a bit later that we really got all the lore concerning their use as symbols of office, because each one of the Elector Counts at this point had their own Runefang. Now, Over the course of the next so many editions, these weapons change a little bit. For example, if we go to the 6th edition of the game and the 7th edition of the game, the Empire were one of the few armies that got 4 army lists. One for 4th edition, one for 6th, one for 7th, and one for 8th. In the 6th and the 7th edition of the game, as I recall, they cost 100 points each, and they had 2 special rules. The first special rule being the one we expect, the Master Rune of Alaric the Mad, the ability to ignore all armor saves. Their second special rule is fascinating because it's automatically wounds. And that means basically if you hit them, they are hurt, it goes straight through their army, boom. Now the reason it's fascinating is because automatically wounding is pretty nasty in Warhammer, but it's also a master rune. Now, for those of you who know your dwarf lore, as we skip over to a different type, to create a runic item, you've got a couple of rules in place that you can't get around. The first of which is, and arguably the most important which, is the great rule of jealousy. No 2 master runes can be inscribed upon the same item or the same artifact. Yet, somehow, it appears that according to the rules of 6th, 7th, and then later 8th edition, because it duplicates these rules, but for only 85 points in 8th edition, not 100. Again, as I recall, been a while since I played that edition. So in those editions, it's got effectively the power of 2 master runes. Master rune number 1 is the Master Rune of Alaric the Mad, and the other master rune is automatically wounding for the Master Rune of LAWhammer. Now, this should be impossible according to the rules, which is super interesting. What's also super interesting is that the artifacts through the course of the various editions of Warhammer get more and more stories heaped upon them, most of which say something along the lines of this. These are some of the most potent dwarven artifacts ever created. Alaric the Mad, the forger of these runes, did something super special when he made them. He was a genius, arguably mad, crazy, or certainly obsessive genius, but a genius nonetheless. And each of these artifacts were considered to be unique because each of them was given a separate, let's say, set of runes, given a separate set of powers that best characterized the peoples that the Runefangs were given to. So, for again, harking back to our Empire lore, each of the 12 tribes that supported Sigmar had a tribal chieftain, and each of these 12 tribes had their own character. Now, if you know your old Warhammer lore, you've probably heard things like Teutigans and Umberigans and Adoses and various other names as well. That's a big garble of letters and vowels. And these are the old tribes, and they all had their own concerns. Some of them were plagued by greenskins, some of them were plagued by trolls, some of them were plagued by other issues, and the Runefangs were created for each of them specifically. But in Warhammer, they all had the same set of rules, which was automatic wound and ignore your armor save. However, you'll find that they were nevertheless characterized as quite different weapons whenever somebody discussed them in the lore. A little bit later, and oh gosh, I can't remember what White Dwarf it is. If anyone out there has the correct White Dwarf, I think it's 235. Oh, let me just bring up some cheers there. Pardon me. Cheer. Where is your Runefang, Andy? I like to keep it in my back pocket. It's an essential place. Thanks very much for that, Tech. Super appreciated for the cheer there. So as I was saying, each of these Runefangs had their own special rules suggested at in the background, but it never really hit the rules of the game. However, it did in some places, and I'll get to that in a moment, because some of the licenses took the Runefangs in different directions. But as I was about to say, White Dwarf number 2235 gives them all names. And these are worth grabbing. I'm just going to grab a little spreadsheet, which I've got in front of me here, just to pull it out, because these are the first time the Runefangs get named. I'm pretty sure it's White Dwarf number 235. Again, if I'm wrong, somebody out there correct me. So they're all given names, and each one of the provinces were given a name, but they were given a name in Reichspiel. That is the language of the Empire. And they were also given a name that was not that White Dwarf number 2325, according to General Caster. I shall take your word for it. Thank you very much. Again, I'm running off my memory here, but I do have the names of them here. So I'll go through the names and I'll discuss each a little bit, because when I was talking to Games Workshop later about what we should be calling the Runefangs, we ended up in a slightly different place, and I shall explain why. So first, we've got Averland that had Mother's Ruin. Next, we had Hochland with Goblin Bane. Middenland with Legbiter, something that always amused me because it was so un-Middenland you could barely shake a stick at it. Next one was Nordland with Crowfeeder, and for those of you who know your Warhammer lore, you'll know that Nordland was not a founding province of the Empire, so the Nordland blade does not come from Nordland, nor was it given to Nordland all those thousands of years ago, well, 2,500, when Alaric the Mad made it. Next is Ostland, Brain Wounder. Next is Ostermark with Troll Cleaver. Then the Reichland with Dragon Tooth, which makes very little sense given you have the Dracwald just over the border. Whatever. Next we have Stirland with Orc Hewer. Then we have Talabicland with Stonebreaker, which makes much more sense. Visenland with Bloodbringer. Always like that one. The Drakvald with Beastslayer. And finally Solland with Grudge Settler. So they were the names that were given inside the White Dwarf. And they were given very little extra detail. And these are the names that you'll often find cited in articles or in later licenses, because that's the only place where they were properly laid down with detail. However, as is often the case with Games Workshop, when new writers came in, they took slightly different directions whenever it was required for their stories. I'll give 2 examples of this, and it'll just stand as a general example for what happened with the blades a little bit later. The first example I will use will be in, I think it was C.L. Werner that wrote the book. Can't quite recall. It was the Runefang book anyway. And it was the description of what happened to one of the Runefangs that were taken after an invasion by Gorbad Ironclaw back in the 1700s. So to give a quick rundown of the Runefang history, it goes something like this. The Empire comes to the Dwarfs' aid, or the Empire to be, Sigmar and his great 12 tribes. They win Blackfire Pass. The Runefangs are commissioned. Sigmar rules for 50 years. The Runefangs still haven't arrived. 50 years after that, all of the Runefangs are delivered at once, having been completed. This is after Sigmar has left, so 50 years after his reign has come to an end. Each of the Elector Counts, as they were then called, the first 12 tribal chieftains were given their Runefang, and these Runefangs came to symbolize the office that they held as an Elector Count. Now, depending upon the lore, you need an Runefang to actually be an Elector Count, or alternatively, as you'll know if you've played Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, that doesn't make a great deal of sense because some provinces have got votes and some very important clerical positions, like the Grand Theogonists of Sigmar, have got votes as well. So it's not just about pointing the sword at a banner that says who you'd like to be the next Elector Count. It's more complicated than that. But at its basic heart, these Runefangs came to be the symbol of office. If you held a Runefang, then you were, if you had the political support, in a position to have the vote. Now, that doesn't just mean holding it. That means having the right to control it. You then controlled the potential for that vote. Over time, 2 of the Runefangs fell out of a position where they were used for a vote. The first of them was the Solland Runefang, because Solland was invaded by Gorbad Ironclaw, which I was just discussing, and the blade was stolen. The second was for the Drakvald blade. Now, the Drakvald, as I recall, the last rule of the Drakvald was a chap called Count Vilner, I think. This is, again, running off my memory. So that'd be around about the 1100s. Early 1100s, he was killed by the Skaven Deathmaster. I think his name was Slike. So Skaven Deathmaster Slike killed the Elector Count of Drakvald, but what really killed the Drakvald was the Black Plague that was running through the Empire at the time, killing not 1 in 10, but 9 in 10 citizens, and the Drakvald was almost entirely wiped out during that time. The Elector Count's blade was then passed over to the Emperor at the time to control, and he pretty much jealously kept it from that point onwards, meaning that it was taken out of the electoral vote position. So one blade went missing, the other blade was no longer used for electoral votes, at least at that point. And that takes us almost up to the future. During the course of all the wars and the Dark Ages and all the horrors that occur between Magnus the Pious bringing the Empire back together again in 2300 and everything before that, the blades are swapping hands again and again and again and being used by various petty warlords to claim that they should have an electoral position or not at various points, until eventually we reach the modern Empire where the blades are disseminated out amongst the Elector Counts. With 2 of the blades, the Gorbad Ironclaw blade has been recovered by this point, with 2 of the blades no longer held by electoral positions, one of them being carried by Kurt Helborg himself. That's the Reichsmarshal, the overall general of the Empire. He holds the stolen blade and uses it, and the other one held in the Imperial Army. So, roughly speaking, we have got ourselves a nice wide selection of Runefangs, and one novel discusses the recovery of the Solid Runefang. Now, you may or may not like that novel, as is often the case with Black Library novels. They sometimes take liberty with the lore. For example, in that one, good old Grudge Settler, renamed as Gallhalter, as I call Grudge Bearer, but it's also called the Light Shard, it's called Hellbringer, it's called Krieg something or another, Kriegerach or something like that. It's called Warpsbane. It's called a host of other names. And it very much speaks to these blades as almost mythical. And the concept that they have a single name is not just roundly nonsense. It's thrown out because the blades themselves don't have on them a handy little scribe mark saying this blade is called Bob or whatever it might be. Indeed, all the way down it's made quite clear that the blades carry names that historically have been associated with them, but it's difficult to pin down exactly what the name actually was. So that being the case, we've got ourselves an interesting Runefang, but they also include one other detail, which I think is worth popping out. And I'm going to go to one of my own articles about this one, just to make sure I don't forget the actual name, because they in there speak about Sunfangs, in particular the Sunfang that was used to create the Solid Runefang and how it was used to empower it. And that was, for me, a key point of lore when it came to examining the Runefangs and trying to make sense of them a little bitty later. Alrighty, so that was the first example of the lore being basically overwritten. We had an established name for the blade, and along came some new lore that went, yeah, whatever, I'm going to ignore that. Graham McNeil did exactly the same thing when he was writing the Sigmar books. He did two major things. Number one, he brought one of the Runefangs in long before they were delivered 100 years after the Battle for Blackfire Pass, 50 years after Sigmar had abdicated his crown. He instead said that actually during one great battle of Middenheim, Alaric the Mad popped up and said, here, have a blade! And this blade was not given the name Leg Biter, as it would later be called. It was given a completely different name, and I have that one written down because I knew I'd forget it. As I recall, I'm just going to pull it out now, it was called Bloodbane because of how it was used during the course of that. Now, Bloodbane is also really interestingly very close to the Grudge Settler names or the Bloodbringer names that are used elsewhere. So you can already begin to see that perhaps blades may have swapped hands during the 2,500-year history, and people didn't quite realize what was happening because there's lots of conquest, and history is terrible at recording events as they actually happened. So we've got ourselves a new blade, Bloodbane, that was carried by a chap called Pendrag, and good old Pendrag, well, he died and it was passed over to his heir. You get how it works. And that blade was supposedly going to be the Midland blade as it was used later, although it was presumably taken back and then re-delivered again at a later date. So we have ourselves another renaming of the blade, giving it a completely different name and also a different set of powers. And you'll find that whenever the blades are used inside fiction, they are often given a variety of different powers that represent the fact that they are some of the most powerful weapons ever created and ever used by the dwarves, stroke the humans, that largely deploy them on the battlefields. If we now compare this to much more modern versions, say, for example, those that are used in Warhammer Quest, the computer game, or alternatively Warhammer Total War, you'll find in Warhammer Total War, all of the blades are again present, and you can get hold of them in a variety of different ways. And all of these blades, every single last one of them, has got the same core rules, which, as I recall, are something like +6 melee and +10% damage, or something like that. And they all have an extra rule as well to speak to what that blade does. So, for example, if you've got, say, Troll Cleaver, you'll do extra damage against big monsters and also be better capable of receiving charges against big monsters. That sort of thing. They're all given their own unique rules because that kind of makes sense. And I strongly approve of that. I think it's a really good iteration of how they were used. So here we are at the end of the end times. We now have ourselves 12 Runefangs as they've been described inside Warhammer. They somehow break the rules for the rule of jealousy for dwarf runes, because they have 2 master runes clearly marked on them by the rules of Warhammer. Yet somehow, still, they do it. We've got ourselves a variety of different backgrounds for what these blades may have been called in the past, what they may have been called in the future. We've got the fact that there's almost certainly more than just one rune on it, the Master Rune of Alaric the Mad, because they all do different things, both in the lore and how they're described, and also in some of the games and how they're deployed. And that brings us up to when I took over the production job in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So we're talking now back in 2000 and approximately, 18, 19, somewhere around there. And I was in a position where I needed to figure out what I was going to do with these artifacts. Now, you might wonder, why did it matter? Well, one of the very first books that I was going to be putting together involved the Electra Countess of Nuln. And Emmanuel von Leibowitz, who we discussed in a previous stream, do go check that stream if you want to know a little bit more about Emmanuel. She had herself a Runefang. And I needed to immediately know which one. Which one did she have? I didn't really need to know what it did, because I could leave that to later when we dealt with the enemy within. But I really needed to know which one it was. Exactly what are we going to do with this? What blade does she have? And I had a pretty brief conversation with Games Workshop at the time that went somewhere along the lines of, hey, there's 12 Runefangs. They've got different names out there. Do you mind if I consolidate it all so that we have a universal set that sits behind the scenes of everything that we create at this end, and instead of using the names that were given to them by humanity, we'll go with the original names, and then we'll just spread it out. And I'll create the Dwarven names for it, for the Catalyst examples. I'll get it all laid out, and I'll also reinforce the idea that some of the blades have been swapped over time. So, for example, at the moment, Beast Slayer, which is currently attached to Drakvald, and you've got Dragon Tooth, which is attached over to the Empire, if I got that the right way around. Yeah, Dragon Tooth for Reichland. That makes literally no sense. Surely, originally, Dragon Tooth would have been from the Drakvald. Dragon Tooth, Dragon Forest. It makes sense. Beast Slayer. And then long discussions were had. Cut a long story short, they went, yes. Yeah, that makes sense. You go do that. You go sort it out. Present it to us. If it's all cool, we're good. So I sorted that all out. And I ended up creating a really big, long document that discussed all 12 Runefangs, where they went through the Grand Provinces, right up to the modern day, when the end of the world happens for the end times, and who was carrying each blade. And that meant that I had a very clear picture of who was carrying each one of the Runefangs come the Enemy Within campaign, meaning that when I did the Enemy Within campaign bits, I immediately had all the goodies laid out there ready to go. So, that being the case, the question was, which ones did I give to whom and what names did we go for? I'm going to drop in a couple of things. I'm also going to mention something else here as well, because we needed to rationalize how good old Alaric the Mad somehow got 2 Master Runes onto it. And after some discussion, we eventually went with the Sunfang option that was presented in the Runefang book. And we said that I think it's Zon Binzan, I think they're called Zon Binzans in Khalazad. So in Khazalid, they had the Zon Binzans, and he was using the Zon Binzan to basically break and separate those 2 runes to allow both of them to be on the same artifact, often on different sides of the blade, but not always, as he experimented with each one of the blades. We also made it quite clear that each one of the blades was completely different. Some of them were big, huge 2-handed ones. Some of them were far more slender, each one of them designed for each one of the tribes that they were going to be going towards. Again, that was very much for the fantasy roleplay version. Obviously, the fantasy battle version could be quite different, as is often going to be the case if you go over to, say, Warhammer Total War, where, again, they had quite a different view. And we went through each one of them, went through the Reichspiel names, and we changed a couple of them that were felt to be perhaps modern contrivances or weird nicknames that no longer really applied, because the only time they had actually ever been named was inside a single White Dwarf article, and it was deemed that that White Dwarf article, because it wasn't part of Warhammer 8th edition, was considered to be secondary. We didn't need to use those names, and Games Workshop said, yeah, you're free to use it as inspiration, you don't need to stick with it. So we did. So to cut a long story short, I'll go through the names that we ended up with, and I will speak to each one of the Khazalid names as well. And it's worth noting that the names that we created, I created and put into place, were exact translations for the original dwarf name that was put in place by Alaric the Mad, assuming that these things were accurate. So we went with Averland, Mother's Rune, which we'll recognize already, which is Rinti Kolak in Khazalid. We've got Dragon's Tooth for the Drakvald, which is Draktuki. You've got Goblin Bane for Hochland, which is Groby Kalak, pardon me. We've got Peak Leveler for Middenland, which is Kara Zornaz. We've got Troll Cleaver for Ostermark, which is Troll Maraz. We've got Thunder Shadow for Ostland, which is Drawn Mornard. We've got Beast Slayer for Reichland, which is Gory Drengaz, which a name for some reason I really love. We have Unyielding Sun for Solend, because it's just a beautiful name. Grimzon. Orc Hewer for Stirland, that's Arki Skundaz. You've got Stonebreaker for Talabik Land, Duras Baraki. You've got Westerland's Blade, Crowfeeder, which is Krali Gulgaz, and is a particularly important blade for the LAWhammer version, because Crowfeeder directly ties through to what's happening with our version of the Lorelorn. If you've watched my most recent episode, you'll understand why Crowfeeder is a particularly important name. That was on just last Friday. It'll be going live on, we're going video on demand on Monday. And then finally, we had the Visenland Blade, Grudge Ender, which is Dama's Vengrin. So this was the names that we used. I also gave them classical names, but I'd never passed those by Games Workshop. So the classical names were purely for our behind-the-scenes work. And if we ever needed them, we'd then present them to Games Workshop and say, perhaps we could use these, perhaps we wouldn't use these, or whatever. So we had names, for example, Mother's Ruin was Matris Ruinum, for example, or Dragon's Tooth was Denti Draconis. You get the idea. That was a good bit of fun. So we explained how Alaric the Mad had somehow managed to break one of the core rules of rune crafting, and had done so in a fashion which was pretty unique with these Sunfangs, which in and of themselves were almost impossible to make. So that was number one. Oh, we got a cheer in there. Let me just go grab that. Thank you very much, Hieronymus Anonymous. You rock. By the way, I love your name, Hieronymus Anonymous. What kind of runefang would Mootland have? A bread knife. He doesn't have a runefang at all, I'm sorry to say. Mootland has none. Mootland is a province that is a grand province, but it's a province without an electoral blade. There is no runefang for the Mootland. There are 12 runefangs in total, and sadly, the Mootland didn't exist when the Empire first received these blades. Mootland doesn't exist until, well, after the first 1,000 years. Ludwig the Fat eventually allows the Mootland to get its own electoral position, gives it land, it gives it a vote with the Elder of the Moot given a vote, but it doesn't carry a runefang in the same way that the good old... let's say Ulrich, the head of the cult of Ulrich, who has a vote for the electoral vote, doesn't have a runefang. Neither does the Grand Theogenist, or either of the two arch-lectors of Sigmar, all three of whom also carry a vote, but they don't have runefangs. So I'm sorry to say there isn't one for the Mootland, as funny as that might have been. So yes, the original blades would obviously have had Kazalid names. They would not have had Reichspiel names. Further, the Reichspiel names that they would have had 2,500 years ago are so different to modern Reichspiel that they're effectively in a completely different language. So if you see something like, you know, Legbiter or some equivalent as a name, that is a modern contrivance for an older version, which is why we went for the Kazalid names first, translated that to modern Reichspiel, and used those, but we then stated quite clearly that most of those names have been lost to time. Further, most of those names were in and of themselves pretty much mythic, allowing us to use different names as and where suited and to have different myths arise. Now, this, in the end, didn't actually matter much because all the stories that I had intended to use for the Runefangs through the course of Death on the Reich up towards the Empire in Ruins didn't come to pass because I resigned from being producer. So all of the ideas that were sitting in my ephemeral mind for how I was going to be using these Runefangs never really came to pass. So instead, all we've got is a few drops here or there. For example, you might find if you look at Rough Nights and Hard Days, there's a mention of the good old Countess of Nuln and her runefang in there. As I recall, my plans were still used for other parts, so you'll find that some of the others have got their runefangs in place as well with their proper original name, and that's fine. So we have ourselves 12 blades, each of which carry at least 2 runes, and then you look at them and you say, well, if we're now intending to develop these for our own games, what do we do? Now, you might be out there going, I don't care. But I think that even if you don't play the games, it's worth considering this, because if you are building them within the rule sets that we understand, you get an idea of what it means for the lore. The lore is very clear that the Runefangs are a masterwork, quite unlike anything created by any other runesmith before or after. They did something that was considered impossible. They broke the good old rule of jealousy, and left the dwarves looking on with a certain amount of, I want to study these and understand how the heck they work. So, loosely speaking, what does that mean that they have on them? Well, 2 master runes, almost certainly. We can see their special rules. We know exactly what they do. In Warhammer, they have 2 master runes, the master rune of Scalf Blackhammer and the master rune of Alaric the Mad. But that means that there's space for 2 other runes on there, just normal runes, not master runes. And that's where, when we were developing them, we placed all of the special rules for each one of the different provinces. So each province had a couple of extra rules dropped on it, dropped on it, that best characterize them. So each one of these blades had 2 master runes and 2 minor runes. Now, in the battle game, master runes pretty much have just a single thing that they do. Like, for example, I ignore all armor saves. But when you're playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, or if you're playing a game like even Total War sometimes, these master runes will manifest in different ways. And if you turn to the fiction, they manifest in completely different ways. Everything that Alaric the Mad was channeled into that spiral rune that Alaric used. So it was obviously more than just cleaving through armor. There's something more going on. So if you're playing the fantasy roleplay game, or if you're writing a novel or doing something else, you can use those runes to do a bit more. Same for any master rune. The minor runes are very much what they are. They do their job. If it's a rune of, say, for example, I can throw a fireball, it throws a fireball. If it's a rune of troll killing, it kills trolls. And you can already see where a blade like Troll Miraz might immediately land. You'd be like, well, I want to have a troll slaying rune on there, and maybe a rune that allows me to get extra strength for cutting them down, or to ignore fear, or something similar. So we went through each one of the 12 Runefangs, and we gave each of them 2 funky little rules for the 2 runes that they carried. And that gave us the core of how each of these 12 Runefangs manifested. Gave them some special rules for our fantasy roleplaying and where we went. Now, I've done that for my game. And if you want to do something similar for your game, the easy job is to simply look at it, give it 2 master runes, and drop on 2 other runes. If you don't know how to create these runes, you've got a variety of rules already out there that you can just copy-paste, either from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition, where you've got a dwarf book there, Stone and Steel, where all the runes are explained, but they were based upon the 4th edition of the Dwarf Army List. So you'll find most of the rules there are just ported over from the Dwarf Army List. You'll find that there are other dwarf rune rules in other books as well. Feel free to pick and choose whatever suits best for you. But loosely speaking, we're looking at 12 blades that are extraordinary, that the dwarfs themselves look at with pride for the fact that they exist at all. They are a standing example of the great alliance between the Empire and the dwarfs, because they were not just given as a gift for saying thanks for ending the Goblin Wars, they were also used by the Empire to be symbols of office and authority pretty much from Sigmar's time to the present day. These blades are not just powerful artifacts, they are politically essential artifacts for the construction of the Empire as it currently stands. Alrighty, so loosely, that's where we get to for the write-up for the backgrounds of them, where they came from, the interesting mixture of rules that they've used over time, how that then influenced what we tried to do with them when I was running Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And then when we move over to LAWhammer, which is my game, and how I've tried to use them, I took everything that we had before and just calcified it down to what each of the blades were, what they looked like, the special powers that each one had because of the rune mixture they had on them. Job's a good one. But then I took the background a little bitty further, which you can do when you're doing your own games. And I tried to consolidate 2 parts of the background that didn't make a great deal of sense. And this is now deep into conspiracy territory theory, because this is not in any way suggested by the lore, beyond the fact that the lore says certain things that don't make sense, and it's up to you to justify that in your own way. So, for example, it's made quite clear that 12 tribes were brought underneath the control of Sigmar under multiple versions of the story of the Battle for Blackfire Pass. But, and I say this but with a pretty heavy capital B, they are not the only 12 tribes that Sigmar commanded at the Battle for Blackfire Pass. I'll give one single example, and that pops up in the lore in more than one book. the Ungals. Now, for those of you who know your Kislev army, you'll immediately go, oh, the Ungals, I know them. Yeah, they're part of Kislev, aren't they? They absolutely are. The Ungals were known to have sent aid to Sigmar. They weren't necessarily part of his empire, but they were there and provided a pivotal role during the battle. Their horse archers came slamming down over one of the flanks. It's described in a couple of places. The Ungals were a core part of winning that battle. And the High King was not rewarding Sigmar, he was rewarding the tribes. Sigmar, in many respects, had already been rewarded. He had bloody Galmaraz, didn't he? Which equally also, according to which version you use of that weapon, probably has 2 master runes on it as well. So there's a whole conversation to be had about Galmaraz one day as well. So we've got ourselves 12 Runefangs plus the potential, if the dwarves are honourable, if the dwarves are saying thank you equally, to at least another 1 weapon being popped out there, possibly. And then on the other hand, that's why there might be more than just the 12. On the other hand, you've got a variety of exceedingly special weapons that lie inside the lore that have, for example, no armor save, the Master Rune of Alaric the Mad added to it. Now, that doesn't mean that they are Runefangs or Runefang equivalent, but if you're looking to run into deep conspiracy territory, you could certainly suggest that it is, particularly if you look towards Kislev, where they already have a 0 armor save frost-laden blade carried by the good old Khan Queen herself. And suddenly things get interesting, particularly when you then look at, say, for example, Death on the Reich, where Barakul, a weapon of extreme puissance, is presented. And the first time it's presented in the rules, again, 0 armor saves. It's quite clearly the Master Rune of Alaric the Mad on that. Indeed, I was 100% going to be running a particularly deep conspiracy using that weapon. I set it up. If you find the very first special edition cover for the Warhammer Fantasy roleplay version of, which book was it? It was Enemy in Shadows. So in Enemy in Shadows, on the special edition, there was a tarot card made. I drew the sketch for that. And it has a bunch of standing stones, and the first standing stone on the right-hand side has Alaric the Mad's Master Rune marked directly upon it. And that was because Alaric the Mad's Master Rune was going to be one of the core component themes for pretty much the entirety of the Enemy Within, because the Runefangs themselves were an essential component to that whole story and how it was going to be presented. Sadly, of course, I did not see that story through because I was no longer developing the books when they eventually got printed. But I did set literally everything up for it, and Barakul was going to be a part of that. So the question is, could these things be lost Runefangs or other artifacts? The answer is, of course, yes, they could be anything you want them to be for your own game. If any of you have watched the LAWhammer version of The Enemy Within, I don't just run with that, I run with that hard. I won't give any spoilers, but as I recall, it's episode 16, which you'll find on this channel if you're on YouTube just now. Episode 16, I think the episode's called The Outlaws. It bears an image of a sword as the little card that I dropped in. I do that quick version of Barakul, if you wish. And again, on that, there was quite clearly the Master Rune of Alaric the Mad and Scalf Blackhammer slapped on the picture as a big hint as to what was going on there. And in that version, without going into any spoilers, it ties directly through to the Runefangs. And that's something that you can do. The Runefangs are not just the 12 blades that we know today. They're also the great stories that are wrapped around them, the myths, the fact that some of them may have been swapped. Maybe that the 12 Runefangs we have today, maybe only 10 of them are actually Runefangs and 2 of them are something else. There's all sorts of things that can happen over 2,500 years worth of history. And I strongly recommend, if you're playing games out there, that you take your own take on it. Build your own stories. Construct your own myths, because it will make your game more interesting and it will surprise your players, because in the end, surprising your players is half the fun. It keeps your long-term games more interesting. And actually on that, since I really should mention this, in 50 minutes time, it is literally in 50 minutes time at the time of me streaming this. If you are watching later, then clearly it won't be. I'm doing a stream over on Rookery Publications, which I'm going to bring up the link for. I've just dropped it into the comments. So go bookmark that. Go check that if you happen to be watching this live, or alternatively, if you're watching this later, then you can go check it out, because that's also the link to the video on demand after I've recorded that one and 50 minutes time. I'm doing a big long stream about how to run long-term campaigns and the difference between short-term ones and what you need to do to try and keep your players engaged, keep yourself engaged, how to tell big epic tales over the course of perhaps years worth of play of role-playing games. Now, if you're a role player and are interested in any of that nonsense, go check me out in 50 minutes over in Rookery Publications. I'm going to be over there having myself the time of my life because I adore long-term campaigns. My last Warhammer one took over 10 years to complete. Vampire the Masquerade before that, over 10 years to complete. I've had, I think, over 10 Warhammer campaigns that have lasted at least 3 years. I've been doing this for quite a while, is what I'm trying to say as he looks at the grey in his beard. So if you want to know more about that, do go check it out. Anyway, that's by the by. Loosely, that gives us the lot. Now, if you want to have yourself a summation of where the Runefangs are in my personal game, this is not where the Runefangs are in life, in terms of the actual lore, go check out my World Anvil article on it, Runefang items. You can go do that. There's a nice breakdown there of all the different Runefangs and how they work. Right, so that now being said, let's pop over to Laughing God. Thank you very much for the super chat. Super appreciated. Would a dwarf PC or NPC be able to determine if a weapon is a Runefang or some other lost or unknown creation of Alaric the Mad? Only if that dwarf is an expert at runes and exactly how those runes express. And even then, not necessarily. After all, simply knowing what a rune is and how it works isn't the same as knowing who put it into place. Unlike some species in the Warhammer world where they may gain some form of revelation or insight from a third party, a god gives them information, or they cast a spell that allows them to know information. Dwarves are far more practical. They're going to be looking at what's directly in front of them, the direct material evidence. But that means that they don't have any magical awareness, so to speak, beyond what runes themselves may tell them. So they've got a rune that allows them to, or a runic device that allows them to divine the nature of something, then yes. Beyond that, it's just going to be experience and knowledge. And certain things are going to make that much easier or less easy, depending upon the nature of the artifact at hand. But loosely speaking, just a dwarf PC or NPC by itself, the answer is absolutely not. But beyond that, possibly, if they've got the right artifacts, knowledge, or similar. Hey, Sam, thanks very much. Thank you very much, by the way, for the little search up. Your Barracool was such an interesting weapon. Oh, thanks very much. And I hope the stories you wanted to tell come through in LAWhammer. Yes, some of them are. And to loosely describe that, when I was sitting down with Graham Davis and we were basically building our version of what the enemy within was going to be, and we would call every single week and did so for like a year or so, discussing every single last tiny detail of that campaign. Very little of all of those discussions came through to the final version that was eventually printed for one reason or another. And some of what we discussed is going to be coming through. And the reason that I say some is because my PCs will only go in some directions, meaning that certain things that could have come out won't, because my PCs will never see them. So LAWhammer is a version. It's most certainly showing some stuff, but I will freely admit LAWhammer dials it all up to 11. We go pretty big. As anyone who just watched the most recent episode will know, we do some pretty crazy stuff. Our version of, for example, Castle Wittgenstein is so far removed from the original printed version that it's barely the same location while simultaneously being almost identical. So, yeah, thank you very much for that, Sam. Some of it is coming through, but not necessarily all of it. Hey, Mandatus, so nice to see you. Always good to see you dropping by. Andy, did you see? I know. Oh, okay, so this is just a small one, which I'm just going to bring up. Did I see that Games Workshop gave gnomes official models? Oh, yes, I did. Now, if you don't know out there, Games Workshop very recently posted news about a new gnome Blood Bowl team. Now, you might be wondering why the hell I care about that. I would suggest going back inside the back catalogue of the LOREhammer videos that we've got over on YouTube and finding the gnome one, and you'll find out just why I care about that. Cut a long story short, I created a section of rules for gnomes in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, and it's fair to say they were pretty controversial for many people. Many people who said that gnomes were not only nothing to do with Games Workshop would never produce a gnome model ever. I would like to say they were wrong. Oh boy, were they. Now, obviously, I had nothing to do with Blood Bowl deciding that gnomes were a good idea, but I do like to think that the fact that I brought them back for the 4th edition of Warhammer and that they became part of an ongoing conversation as to whether they should exist or not influenced things over into Blood Bowl, and we got ourselves some Blood Bowl gnomes. Now, obviously, the Blood Bowl gnomes are far more, let's say, almost comical and stereotypical than the version that we wrote for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, where I very much went for a somewhat darker version where we're still using the illusions. They still had relatively pointy hats because we couldn't resist ourselves. I got Mark Gibbons to do the concept art for those. But if you don't know Mark Gibbons, you really bloody should. To cut a long story short, I brought them back and then Blood Bowl did it. And all the people who said that Games Workshop would never do gnomes ever again have been proven completely and utterly wrong. So yeah, I love them. I think they're great, and I particularly love the Fox models because who doesn't love a Fox model? So yeah, that's super fun. I'm just going to bring up this one here from Urska. I think Warhammer Fantasy Battle 4 said that Kislev's Frost Sphere was forged by Alaric, which never made much sense. The Empire books seem to want to make Kislev into the 11th Grand Province. It did to a degree, and it was incorporating those ideas which were absolutely essential. Now, I linked through to one of my links from earlier concerning how I built the Runefangs. You'll note at the bottom of that article, that was my Runefang article. I've linked it in the chat further up. You'll notice in that one I've got a Lost Blade controversy, and that includes Fearfang. And exactly how Fearfang or Fearfrost, depending upon which version of the name you go for, or Frostfear you've written there, is used. And obviously it couldn't be a blade for the Ungolls who currently carry it, because the Ungolls were not there at the time. But that doesn't mean that the blade couldn't have been created by someone else, that it hasn't changed over time or being used in different ways. So yeah, I incorporated that. I also incorporated what was clearly the original intention for the 4th edition. The implied intention by the 4th edition writers, where Kislev was very much wrapped up into the Empire. So I thought that would be a nice way to build a controversy directly into the version of the rules and the version of the artifacts that I was presenting, which was really kind of fun. Did I say something else? Did I say a different one? I'm just bringing that one up there. Did I mean the Gothstars weren't there? Yes, I meant the Gothstars. If I said something else, oh, did I say Ungolls? Oh man, that was a crime. Yeah, Gospodars. The Gospodars arrived much later. You never know that I wrote the Kislev book, eh? Yeah, the Ungolls were in the area for absolutely ages, long before the tribes of Sigmar were even doing their thing, running through the Reich Basin and what would eventually become the Empire. The Ungolls were already there. And as we've covered in various videos, both for Lorebeards and elsewhere, humanity is not a new species. It has been on the Warhammer world since the Cataclysm. It is as old as every other species, like the elves or the dwarves or similar. So the idea that there are tribes that are much older than Sigmar is not exactly a new thing. So yes, I did mean the Gospodars. I apologize for saying Ungolls there. That just is how it sometimes falls out. Right, so do we need to cover anything else? It's, as is often the case with these small LOREhammer streams, we're focusing on a very tight subject so we can get through them quite quickly. I think I'll do a summation. If anyone's got any extra questions about it, do drop it into the chat. And if you've got it, that'll do. We have ourselves officially 12 Runefangs. These 12 Runefangs are considered to be some of the most puissant artifacts that were ever created. They were created by a runesmith by the name of Alaric the Mad, who would become synonymous with genius and, one could argue, dangerous obsession. His artifacts, in terms of the rules that they're presented in Warhammer, appear to show that they have 2 master runes on, which is supposedly impossible. Through the development of these artifacts, you'll find that not only has it got rules for 2 master runes, but various games have added extra rules for each one of these Runefangs as well. That being the case, when I presented my version for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and for LAWhammer as well, I gave each one of them the 2 master runes. I explained exactly how it worked, using the Sunfang special artifact that was used by Alaric the Mad, only he had created that bad boy, plus 2 other runes on top as well, which is super fun. Also, to support all the stuff I was writing, I wrote somewhere in the region of, I don't know, about 5,000 words of history, explaining the complete set of Runefangs right the way from the time of Sigmar all the way up to the modern era so that I could understand where they were whenever we were doing ourselves, say, for example, a historical reference. So if somebody said, back in 1258, something occurred and it involved someone that I knew had a runefang, I could drop the detail on it if it was required. I like whenever I'm doing writing or maps or anything else, having all the core material make sense behind the scenes before I tackle the material we're going to be presenting to ensure it all makes sense and we don't get the contradictions that Games Workshop is absolutely famous for. But having said that, though, the contradictions are part of the fun of it, because without them, the Runefangs would be far duller. If it wasn't for the extra material that people like Graham McNeil added, or I think it was C.L. Werner when he did Werner, I think. I can't remember who did the Runefang book. Doesn't really matter. If it wasn't for these contradictions and the names being different in different books and their powers being different, we wouldn't be able to come in afterwards and say, well, how can we make sense of this all and make them far more fascinating, deeper, and different in terms of how we then present it for our own games. Right, I'm going to see if there's any interesting comments coming up near the end. Out of curiosity, what special rules effects did you give your fangs? I'm not sure if I've got that here. Let me just quickly see if I've got that open. Runefangs. Do I have it open? Yeah, I'll drop it through really quickly. So Rinty Kolak, that's the Averland Blade. Mother's Ruin had a Rune of Fury and Striking. On top of obviously the 2 Master Runes and the special rules I made for each one of them. The Drakval Blade, that's Draktuki, had Dragon's Breath and Slaying Dragons. The Hochland Blade, that's Groby Uzkalaz, had Detection Goblins and Slaying Goblins. Midland Blade, Kara Zornaz, had Cleaving and Smiting, and it literally killed everything it touched. Nasty blade. The Ostamar Blade, Troll Miraz, had Might and Slaying of Trolls. The Ostland Blade, Dorn Mornar, had Passage and Speed. You like a shadow, you could move through anything. Super fun one, that one. And very much supported the way that Valmar von Raukov, who bore that blade, worked on the battlefield, which was super fun. And the Reichland Blade, that's Gori Drengas, had Courage and Slaying of Beastmen. The Solon Blade, Grimzon, had Iron and Fire. Grimzon, Burst into Flame. Good, fun blade. The Azaborn Blade, from Stirland, that's Urki Skundaz, that had a Rune of Slaying on Orcs and a Rune of Death for Orcs. The Vesterland Blade, Talabicland Blade first, which is Duras Baraki, had Breaking and Smashing. It went through everything. Westerland had Krali Gulgaz, had Fear and Wounding, a proper scary one, that one. And the Visenland Blade, Damas Vengren, had Detection of Ancient Blood and Grudges, and had a Rune of Grudges on it as well. It was very much a hunt down your enemies and murder them. They'll never escape you. Ha, 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 ha. Which was super fun as well. So, loosely speaking, that's the runes that we used, or at least I was using. Will they change in my most recent iteration for LAWhammer? Probably, because whenever I do a new set of rules, I tend to go through everything and go, oh, I could use that one instead. That makes more sense to the stories we're telling today. Because in the end, it's all about the narratives that you're attempting to present, or at least that's how I try to build these rules as I'm putting them together. Right, next, the fact that a Runefang was created was specifically for goblins show how frightful they can be. That's to a degree true, but not really. The goblins at this point have been defeated, so the Runefangs aren't really just for showing that goblins should flee from them or some equivalent, assuming that's what you meant. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier in the stream, the very original Runefangs actually had runes for undead slaying on them, not for goblin slaying or anything similar. They were all undead slaying weapons. I feel like the various Warhammer rulers have largely started them well below how powerful they should be. Would you agree? Yes. Not just yes. Heavily yes. The versions that I've seen have all been pretty much weak-ass, terrible versions. Take a look at, for example, the original Empire in Flames and how they handled the Hammer of Sigmar in there. Compare that to its very simple rules for Warhammer Fantasy Battle. There should be a little bit more there. Some humans may be older than the Cataclysm. Indeed, it is said so inside the most recent version of the Old World. So I wonder why you might think that, Sage. General Caster, are all the Runefangs identical or are they physically different in some way? They are described as different in more than one source. So yes, it seems very likely they're all physically different. They're most likely to be hand and a half swords, about bastard sword size. So a bit smaller than a massive two-handed sword, a bit bigger than your standard broadsword, relatively big. But having said that, they're described as each one working for the tribe that they were crafted for, so they are going to be different. Yes, a lot of humans were older than the Cataclysm. Well, I'm gonna have to go really quickly. All physically different, but there's some human. Yeah, but all saying the same things about there. Can confirm it was Sale Werner. Thank you very much, Executor. I couldn't recall off the top of my head. That's what happens with these unplanned streams. I just say whatever happens to be in my memory at the time and hope it's right. Thanks for my thanks a lot for that one. Is quite the opposite. It's a bloody horrendous blade. Truly awful. Thanks very much, Laughing God. Hugely appreciated for the super chat there. Is there a resource that has the type of sword or design of each of the Runefangs that we can look up for a visual reference? The answer is no. There isn't one. You will need to either make your own or alternatively go if someone else has made their own and use theirs. Now, I have it for mine somewhere. I don't have it in front of me, but the biggest blade, for example, in my version is it's Karazorna's, isn't it? So that's Midland blade. Truly huge blade, and a blade that was literally in my stream last Friday, mentioned directly there. That's the blade that's carried by good old Boris Todbringer come the end times. By far the biggest of them, where the smallest, or at least the most slender, as I recall, is the Visenland blade. I think Grudgender. I think it's like a duelist weapon. It's still long, but it's a far thinner, slender blade. Again, that's off the top of my head. I need to go check my rules. Can't recall, but there's no official source for that. So if you want an official source, you'll need to, well, not get one. It's fair to say that when the old world tackles the Runefangs, which eventually at some point it will, we'll almost certainly get yet another version of them, where they might decide to rename them entirely, they might decide to try and stick with the names that we used previously, or they might do something else completely different. We'll find out when the old world dives in heavily. Estanaces! Hey. So is the 15 Runefangs controversy true in LAWhammer then, or is it a lie from a nefarious source? I shall not confirm nor deny that one, because to do so is to explain plots that will almost certainly come up at a later point in our game. Alrighty. I quite like that. At the end of our stream, we have discussed the 12 Runefangs. We've discussed that they could go beyond that if you wish to do so for your own games. If you're a role player, in about 30 minutes, I'm going to be starting a stream about how to run really long campaigns. If you've got any questions, you can go pre-submit them right now over in Discord, which I'm just going to bring up a link for, just in case you happen to want to edit, copy link. Now, you're going to have to be super fast if you want to pre-submit a question over there. That's the Discord link over for the Rookery's Discord. And that should hopefully take you directly to the questions for me link. If you don't pre-submit, I can't guarantee that you'll get your question answered, because my answers for a lot of these are going to be relatively in-depth, because I have run a lot of long-term campaigns, and I think that a lot of people don't approach them in the best way, and they don't do things that make running the campaigns more fun. And ultimately, that's what we're all about if we're doing role-playing games. So I'm quite looking forward to doing that one. That's going to be in about half an hour. It starts at 7 p.m. UK time, which is about half an hour from the time that I'm streaming this. If you happen to come up this stream much later and would like to go watch it, I dropped the link up for the stream earlier, which is also the video on demand link. But I'm going to get it again just in case you miss it, so that you can all Control-C and just Control-V that into place there. Control-V. Thanks. Oh, Rogan drops in there. 15 Runefangs made for the kings of men to bind them to good pints and facial hair. Although they weren't all kings of men. Some of them were queens of men. You'll find that the ancient Warhammer world was nowhere near as sexist as parts of it would later on become. Good old Queen Freya, for example, who ends up she's the one who gets Bloodbringer. Bloodbringer? Damas Vengrim, pardon me. A rather nasty blade. So, yeah, there we go. I think that's a good place to end it. I would like to say thanks very much, and especially thanks to those of you who dropped us super chats like Rogan. Enormously appreciated, because, well, you know, it's always nice to be able to eat. I'm going to go take a quick break for half an hour and then go stream over on the Rookery If you need, if you have any question you want to pre-submit, I've already posted the link. Go check that out now and go drop down a question if you have some. There's a bunch of questions there already. So if you go and read those, you might go, oh, they missed that. I'd like to ask that. Go ask there. Beyond that, I'm also doing a stream tomorrow with Lore Master of Sotek. That's going to be about Middenheim, the city of the White Wolf, or the city of chaos, depending upon which version of the book you look at. And that's going to be super fun. I'm currently doing a giant map of Middenheim. And that's for my own game, and it's proven to be a little bit bigger than I would originally have liked, because I only put aside a few hours to try and do it. Almost certainly not been enough, because I've got tons of writing I want to do as well. So that's not going to be ready for at least another week, if not longer, because I've got very little actual free time to do that with. So that's Middenheim, City of the White Wolf, tomorrow at 4 p.m. UK time, where good old Lore Master Sotek and I will be discussing that at length. It's a city that is bizarrely important for the entirety of the Warhammer world, way more so than anyone would originally have expected. So I'm really looking forward to that one, just to discuss it all out and talk out why it becomes such a core component for the entirety of the Warhammer world, and why it happened in reality, as in why that city was chosen to represent so much, and whether that was a good idea at all in the first place. So beyond all that, I will see you hopefully in around about half an hour. Other than that, I will see you tomorrow over in Lorebeards. And the Lorebeards episode tomorrow will be on the Lore Master Sotek's channels. So do go check Lore Master of Sotek's channels over on YouTube or Twitch if you want to catch that one. Other than that, see you all later. Bye-bye!